Zach is 22 years old. He's from Cincinnati, Ohio. Today he has 31 days clean and sober. Yeah, so Zach is a really good guy. Met him in inpatient rehab when I was over at Michael's house. He's like a little brother to me. We've gotten along just great from the very start. You know, we were both going through some pretty rocky stuff, to say the least, while we were in treatment together. And he's just been a huge part of my recovery. We're actually roommates now at Kinseely Sober Living. He's a great dude. Has an open mind as far as God goes, and he's definitely a huge part of my life, and I'm really grateful to have him. So.
Awesome. All right. Anybody else want to say something about?
My name is Len Yu, and her name is Song, my wife. We came from far away, New Jersey, and we just stopped by here, maybe possibly thinking about the move in Palm Spring sometime, and we working on it, but I'm not sure when. I think this Wednesday Bible study is a good study for me too. So I happened to be in Clay last week, so that's why I got information meeting over here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Suffering, because it's something that we all do. We all suffer. And our passage tonight is going to be from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Just a few verses, but probably one of the most powerful passages in the New Testament. And I'm going to read through it and give a little background, put it in context so we kind of get what's going on in the passage, and then we'll go through it in detail and dig out some of the really amazing things that it has to tell us. So, 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. Starting in 7, this is Paul speaking. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Curious passage, but really amazing. So after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, this is 2 Corinthians, after he wrote 1 Corinthians, he had to make a hurried trip back to Corinth to visit the church, because many of the issues that he identified in 1 Corinthians had not been corrected. The church was really in disarray. And it stands to reason, because this church was located in Corinth. And Corinth was the original Sin City. So there were a lot of influences going on in the city of Corinth, that, and maybe Torrance too, but in Corinth for sure, there were distractions to this young church. Now the centerpiece in Corinth was the great temple of Aphrodite, one of the wonders of the ancient world. And the one fact about the great temple of Aphrodite, which always caught my attention, was that the staff consisted of 1,000 prostitutes. So this kind of gives you an idea of what Corinth was all about. The excavations in Corinth have also revealed that there was a very active tavern industry going on in that city. So when you put alcohol and lust together, you have trouble. And this congregation, this young congregation, was in trouble. To sort of put a pin in that, this place was so bad that there was a term that developed, and it was called to Corinthianize. If in that world you were Corinthianizing, what you were doing was regularly practicing fornication. So that city earned its name. So Corinth, to sum it up, was it was typified by the worship of false gods and alcohol-fueled orgies with temple priestesses. Wow. This was a wretched, debauched city. It's a great place for Paul to plant a church. Must have been a frightening place for him to plant a church. Now, the issues that, yes?
Can I just add it? There is a Corinth Canal. The canal between the two.
Right,
seas.
the isthmus. There's a canal that goes through it. It's kind of a mini version of the Panama Canal. That the ships would go through that. They'd pull them through the shallow waters to avoid them having to go down around the south tip of Greece, where the Mediterranean, where the Adriatic met the Aegean Sea. It was very tumultuous and the ships were at risk. So they would go through Corinth. So it was in effect a port city with a lot of other things going on too. Now, the issues that Paul addressed in 1 Corinthians included, these were the things that he hurried back to Corinth to try to address. There were divisions in the church. The people in the church decided that the various leaders of the church were more important than Jesus Christ. So you had one segment that followed Paul and one segment that followed Apollos. And no one was really following Jesus. So there were divisions in the church, and there was rank immorality. There's actually in 1 Corinthians reference made to incest in the congregation. So there was all kinds of stuff going on there. And after his hurried visit, some of these problems sort of resolved themselves. He came down on them hard, and in part, 2 Corinthians was written to express his joy over the church's favorable response to his visit. But after he visited, a new problem developed that was even worse. And that was the false teachers in Corinth attempted to challenge his apostolic authority. At that time, you could only be an apostle if you had seen the risen Lord. That was what qualified you to be an apostle. And Paul claimed apostolic authority not by walking with Jesus after he had arisen, because Paul was busy during that time actually persecuting the church. So it was before his conversion. But he claimed his authority to come from the fact that he had 4 supernatural experiences with Jesus where he interacted with him. The problem was that there was no one else that witnessed it and could attest to the fact that he had seen the risen Lord. So these false teachers attacked his claim to have apostolic authority. And they actually put on a campaign to destroy him. They claimed said a lot of bad things, just like our Bible study last week. Hurtful words, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And the case that I made was that words will hurt you. Well, they said some harsh words about Paul. They said that he lied about his credentials, that he falsified the history of his ministry. He had a secret hidden life of shame, and he ministered for money and for the favor of women.
Wow.
And if that wasn't bad enough, he was ugly and boring. So they said a lot of bad things about him. Very hurtful words. And no one stood up for him. No one stood up for him. And so he wrote 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 7 through 10. Actually, he wrote chapters 10 through 12 in an overall attempt to try to defend himself against the false teachers and to try to legitimize his apostleship and regain his character. You know, Satan loves to wage this kind of war against anyone who is out trying to spread the word of God. And this was Satan empowering the false teachers to go after Paul with a vengeance. So he writes the last couple of chapters of 2 Corinthians, and particularly these verses, as a deeply wounded person. And he really lays his heart open to us. And what we're going to read through tonight, what we're going to study tonight, is really at the heart of his defense of his authority and of his character. It's an emotionally charged passage, and as I said, it's one of the most important passages in the New Testament. And it's an interesting thing to me because this passage points out more than any other passage that I'm aware of that the deepest pain we feel in life is generally pain over relationships. It's the pain of our soul over broken relationships, and that's what was going on here. You know, Paul was no stranger to physical pain, and in fact, in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians, he kind of counted the house regarding all of his physical pain. In verses 23 through 27, 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I've spent in the deep. I've been on frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from my countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers on the sea, dangers among the false brethren. I've been in labor and hardship, through many sleepless nights and hunger and thirst, often without food and cold and exposure. But then he concludes, apart from such external things, there is the daily pressure of me, or on me, of concern for all the churches. So Paul was in effect saying that he had suffered a lot of physical hardship during his ministry, but none of it was as bad as the daily pressures on him caused by the concern for the churches and concern for the efforts of these false teachers, in this case to destroy the church at Corinth. This is what really bothered him the most. So in the midst of all this suffering, this was really intense suffering, God taught Paul 4 very important lessons, and he's passing them on to us in this brief passage. And these are lessons that I think we should all take to heart and really embrace as we face our own sufferings. And we will all face our own sufferings. We're probably facing sufferings now. In this life, we're either going into trouble, we're in trouble, or we're coming out of trouble. And it just goes around and around and around. That's the way it is. So this makes this an extremely important passage. So I want to go through it verse by verse, and I want to identify what those 4 important lessons are. The first one, I think we see in verse 7, and the lesson is that God uses suffering to humble us. God uses suffering to humble us. Remember in verse 7, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. So God uses suffering to humble us. Now, Paul is talking about this revelation, the greatness of the revelation that he's referring to. He's talking about one of his encounters with the risen Lord. And he actually talks about it earlier in chapter 12. He speaks of it in very general terms, though. He says, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago, whether in the body I do not know, or out of the body I do not know, God knows, such a man was caught up to the 3rd heaven. The 3rd heaven is the highest state of heaven. That's where God is. And I know how such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body I do not know, God knows, was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which no man is permitted to speak. So Paul had just reported this experience where he had been caught up to the 3rd heaven, had a personal audience with God, and was put back on earth. And so immediately he says, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself. To keep me from exalting myself. I mean, this tells us that as spiritually mature as Paul was at this time, pride was still an issue for him. Pride was still an issue. And I think we tend to put sin in categories. I think it's just cultural. We're raised in a culture where this is good, this is bad. And so we look at specific things as being sin, whereas sin is anything that misses the mark. I think here we're being told that the range of sin, it goes from humility which is the ultimate virtue, to pride, which is the ultimate sin. And wherever you are on that track, that's where you are in your sin life. When you're humble, you're living out the ultimate virtue. When you're prideful, you're living out the ultimate sin. You know, you'll recall, as reported in the Old Testament, that Satan and a third of the angels were thrown out of heaven because of pride. They wanted to be like God. Satan wanted to be like God. And Adam and Eve, when they were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, it was because Eve, when she was tempted by the serpent, wanted to be like God. She wanted to know good and evil. And those ultimate sins are all driven by pride. You know, I try to put myself in Paul's position. Imagine this. If all of a sudden you're walking down Palm Canyon and you disappear, God takes you up to heaven, and he meets with you, and he says, Steve, I want you to go down and I want you to minister my gospel and I'm going to be with you. And then he sets you back down on Palm Canyon. It would be hard not to feel pretty special. I would say this would give you bragging rights. And it might be very tempting to brag about it. And remember that Paul's apostolic authority was being challenged here by these false teachers. How tempting would it have been for him to fight back and say, wait a minute, I sat with the risen Lord and he told me thus and such. It would have been so easy to exercise that pride, and God knew that, and that's why he gave him the thorn in the flesh. There was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Now, pride always leads the parade of sin. And God was concerned about Paul's pride. And all pride is fueled by Satan. You know, Satan is behind the self-esteem cult. This is all Satan-driven. To make us prideful, sinful. It's easy to look at ourselves as being special or having merit, when in fact we don't. And this is the type of pride that leads that parade of sin. Now, Satan wants us to exalt ourselves. He wanted Paul to lash out at the false teachers and brag. On the other hand, God wanted him to be humble. And God wants us all to be humble. So to counterbalance Paul's great blessing, which could have led to pride in Paul's character, God gave him a thorn in the flesh. Now, I think it's important to dwell on what a thorn in the flesh is. Is it like a rose bush, a thorn on a rose bush? When you go to the basic root word translated as thorn here, it means a stake. It means a stake. It's not just a little prick that he had. It was a shaft that was rammed through him, impaling him. This was great pain that Paul was experiencing, a tremendous burden. So just what is the thorn in the flesh? There are a lot of theories about what the thorn in the flesh was, none of them based on any biblical language. I mean, there are people that believed he had an eye disease because in one of the epistles he says, see how large I write my signature. Well, he must have had an eye disease because he had to write large, he couldn't see. Other people thought that he had malaria. There are all sorts of theories of what it was. I think the answer lies in this very verse. He says, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Now, in the Greek, messenger is angelo, and it's literally an angel of Satan. So there was an angel of Satan, a demon, that was sent to torment him. And I don't think he was demon-possessed. I think what he was experiencing was a demon of Satan empowering the false teachers to just rip and shred his church at Corinth to pieces. I think Satan infiltrates all false religions and uses them for his own ends, and I think that's what he was trying to do in the church at Corinth. Hung on torrents, I don't know what it is. A messenger of Satan to torment me. Now, torment is also an interesting word. That word is used in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. And it's really used, the same word that's translated torment is used to describe the Roman soldiers beating Jesus with their fists in the face. That's the torment. So what Paul is really saying here is that I'm taking a beating. I'm taking a beating. It's really staggering to think that God so wants us to be humble that he'll even use Satan and his demons to humble us. It reminds me in the Gospel of Luke when Jesus was preparing Peter for his fall, his denial, he said to him in chapter 22, verse 31, "Behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat." That's what Satan wants to do, sift us like wheat, and God allows it, if we need it, to be humble. And not hidden in all of this to me is the fact that God uses everything to accomplish his ends. He uses evil people, he uses circumstances, and he even uses Satan. As John said in 1 John in his epistle at 4:4, "Greater is he who is in you, Jesus, than he who is in the world," Satan. So Satan is definitely subordinate to God, and he uses even Satan to humble us. So now lesson 2, so lesson 1 is that God uses suffering to humble us. He wants us to be humble because only when we're humble are we in a holy state. The more we move up the spectrum toward pride, the more sinful our life becomes, and this doesn't please God. So in verse 8, we're taught the second lesson, that God uses suffering to draw us to him. Verse 8 says, "Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me." So God uses suffering to draw us to him. Paul is in effect saying, I can't take what's happening to the Corinthian church, and he implores the Lord. Now the root word for implores is a begging word. So Paul's basically begging God to remove the church from harm's way. Have you ever begged God for something?
Yeah.
Yes? I'm sure we all have. I think it's the right way to go about it. I think going to the Lord when you're seeking that is the right way to go about it. We're powerless against Satan. So if we're being tormented by Satan and his demons, we can't go face to face. We can't go head on with him. We're powerless. We can only go to God. So I want to point out, as demonstrated in verse 8, that profound suffering has a positive effect on our prayer life. Increases the fervency of it, increases our intimacy with God. You know, think about it. The most fervent, passionate prayers I've ever prayed occur when I'm just flat on my back and just really, really being pressed. So it brings us closer to God. And maybe this is why Paul prayed in Philippians at 3:10. He said that I may know him, Jesus, and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. Paul prayed that he would know the fellowship of Jesus' suffering. He got it. He understood that in that suffering we draw as close as we can possibly be drawn to our Lord.
Question, should we be like rejoicing sometimes in our state of desperation?
Yeah, it sounds weird, doesn't it? But I'm gonna touch on that, and then I think we should talk about it. It's a weird concept, but that's just like God. Everything's backwards with God. You know, we have one view, and as people living in America at this point in time of general affluence in this country, we don't like pain. And when we experience pain, we pray to be removed from that pain. But that's not really always the best thing. So the second lesson is that God uses suffering to draw us closer to him. And it makes sense when you think about it. It's very true. Now we go to the third lesson, that God uses suffering to display his grace. This is verse 9. So Paul is begging him. 3 times he begs him that this thorn might leave him. So what he's in effect saying, 3 times I went to the Lord and I begged him to take my church at Corinth out of harm's way of these false teachers. God's answer to him, my grace is sufficient for you. For power is perfected in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. How would you feel if you're suffering and you go to God begging him for relief? He says, no, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is sufficient for you. No relief is coming. No relief is coming.
Excuse me. One comment. Maybe we need to feel the suffering to be more closer to God.
We do. We do. That's kind of where we're going here. Suffering is not, we see suffering as a negative thing. I think we can all look back on in our lives, I certainly can, the things that I went through that were absolutely the worst things that have ever happened to me, in the rearview mirror, look like the best things that ever happened for me. I think we've all had that experience. And if it weren't for the suffering, we wouldn't be where we are today, living a more holy, blessed life. You know, how many times have we been in the spot Paul has been in where we're not given relief? Sometimes we are, but not always. Sometimes we don't have relief for a long, long time. How many of them have been in a situation where we've prayed for the recovery of a loved one and the loved one dies? Strong medicine. I think when we cry out to God, what he often says to us is what the writers of Hebrews said in chapter 4 at verse 16. Let us come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. That's what God gives us in our time of need. He gives us grace to help. He pours out his grace. So he doesn't give relief always by removing the thing that's causing the problem. What he does instead is he gives you the grace to endure that problem. To endure that problem. You know, grace is really at the heart of this entire passage that we're reading. This is the centerpiece concept of this passage. And grace is an interesting word. The Greek word for grace is charisin. And it's used 155 times in the New Testament. 155 times. So it's an important concept, and we should try to understand it. And I can use words to explain it. I think it's almost something that you have to feel in order to understand. But I think it means divine favor. It means God favoring you through a hard time, through a difficult situation. It's given by God. It's a gift. It's nothing we earn or merit, because we don't. It's given by God. It was paid for by Jesus on the cross, and it can't be earned by us. It's just something that God gives us when we draw close to him.
A blanket of security.
In a sense, it is a blanket of security. It is a blanket of security. And in the Bible, every time grace is spoken of, it's spoken of in superlative terms, in lavish terms. Ephesians 2:7, Paul refers to it as the surpassing riches of his grace. So it's always spoken of in superlatives. John 1:14 refers to Jesus as being full of grace. 1 Peter 4:10 refers to the manifold grace of God. It's multifaceted. It's multifaceted. And Paul himself, again in 2 Corinthians 9:8, God is able to make all grace abound to you. Not just grace abound to you, all grace abound to you. In fact, grace saves us. It sanctifies us. It enables us to understand the Word of God. It gives us wisdom. It gives us the power to overcome temptation. It enables us to serve. And as with Paul in this passage, it carries us through times of great suffering. So I want to talk for a minute about grace in the context of suffering, because that's what's going on here. As I said, life equals trouble. Job 5:7, man is born for trouble. John 16:33, in the world you will have tribulation, but take courage, I have overcome the world. Because Jesus has overcome the world, His grace is sufficient for you and me. He's the most powerful force in the universe. So is there sufficient grace? So maybe we've established, yes, there is grace, and it's lavish, but is there sufficient grace to carry us through the periods of most profound suffering? And I would say yes. And I would say the greater the trouble, the greater the flood of grace that God gives us to help us through that period of trouble. Remember Hebrews 4:16, let us come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find help, grace to help in times of need.
When I was in a great danger and I was going out, I just pray that somebody gonna hear my cry for help. And it happened. I was almost gone. I was gone, almost upstairs.
Finds grace to help in time of need. Now, grace is...
I could not talk because my father was choking me. But I sent a signal to my grandma who knocked at the door and make him realize that he's hearing me. I was talking.
Grace to help. Now, grace isn't just a New Testament concept. It's apparent in the Old Testament too. It's a little different word. It's loving kindness in the Old Testament. And I love Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23, written by Jeremiah. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. So in God's economy, every day is a new day of his grace. And those loving kindnesses never cease. And this one in one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 33, the God of Israel rides the heavens to your help. It's kind of a great word picture. The God of Israel rides the heavens to your help. Neat concept. So the conclusion of the story of God's grace is that we should enter our trouble aggressively. We should charge trouble. And we should embrace our pain. Because I think what Paul's telling us is that we're going through that period of pain for a reason. It's part of God's plan for us. We may not be wise enough to understand it or intelligent enough to see what he's doing, but it's part of his plan for us and we should embrace it. And in all of this, God is humbling us by this suffering, whatever it is that we're suffering. He's drawing us closer to himself and he's displaying his grace. He uses these times of suffering to display his grace. So now finally, this last half of verse 9 and the entirety of verse 10, the fourth lesson is that God uses suffering to perfect his power. Interesting concept. So 9b and 10. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So what he's saying in 10, after having gone through this process with God, going back to verse 28 of the last chapter where he says, apart from such external things, there's the daily pressure on me of concern for all the churches. By the time he gets to verse 10 in chapter 12, he's saying, I'm well content with all of these things because I now understand that in my weakness, God's power is displayed. God's power, in fact, begins to operate in us when we no longer have anything left of our own. When we have nothing else to turn to but God, that's when he starts moving. The very suffering that humbles us, that draws us into God's presence, that dispenses his grace, is the same thing that makes us powerful. Unfortunately, as long as we keep trusting in our own ingenuity, our own cleverness, our own money, our own ability to solve all problems, we're going to be weak. We're going to be weak. It's interesting that no one is too weak to be powerful. Paul's definitely on the ropes in this passage, but he's powerful. He's overcoming the attacks on his character, the challenges to his apostolic authority. He's going to rise in power to refute that powerfully in God's name. So no one is too weak to be powerful, but many are too strong to be powerful. I think as long as we are too strong, we're never going to be powerful, because we're going to try to solve all these problems ourselves, trust in our own ingenuity, cleverness, money, etc. So based on all these considerations, Paul really declares in verses 9b and 10, number one, he says, okay, I get it. I understand this suffering thing and the humility and drawing me closer to you. I think he says, I understand it's about humility. I understand it's about intimacy. I understand it's about grace. And I understand that it's about power. And therefore, I embrace the suffering. And in fact, he embraces that stake that's been rammed through his heart. So therefore, what I conclude from all of this, it's very wrong for us to believe something like the following. Well, I'm a Christian. That means everything should be going great. Isn't that what they told me? Now, if things aren't going great, this is another wrong thought. It's because I don't have enough faith. Has anyone ever said that to you? Yeah. Well, you'd do better if you just had more faith. Maybe it's because I haven't read the right book, or I haven't heard the right message. All wrong thinking. All wrong thinking. And maybe if I just do these things, that I can extricate myself from this mess and get on with my glorious life in Jesus. Now, that's a warped view of Christianity. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people walking around that have that view of Christianity. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality of the situation is, when God is really working in our lives, He puts us in places of pain and suffering. It's just a fact of life. And in the midst of that suffering, we find our real power, and that's the ability to endure and persevere and push through that period of pain and suffering and get to the other side and have our faith strengthened because I've made it. God got me through this mess. We find the power to persevere, to endure, and succeed. And this is why Paul declares in verse 10, I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. So my advice really to everyone, and particularly to myself, is as we suffer through the inevitable trials of life, we need to embrace the pain, we need to embrace the suffering, and we need to keep in mind that by doing this, what we're really doing is embracing God's divine purpose for us. So, Jeremy, to answer your question, I think when you really think about what this passage is telling us, it's telling us don't shy away from pain and suffering, because you're not going to outrun it. It's going to catch you. And the only way to get through it is to embrace it, and through the grace of God to allow yourself to be carried through it. Not in your own power, but in God's power.
This reminds me of several things we've talked about recently, but one of them was what Sadiq had said about the training, the military training, and how having that training gives you the practice to get to the other side and be content during that struggle, during the tough part, to have that contentment. It's only the training through these things that allows that. So the more we go through things, I think what God's trying to do is shorten the time period within which we fear and struggle, so that we still go through the bad time, but we're not going to fear through it. We're not going to struggle through it and all that, because He's shown us over and over and over again that I got you to the other side. It all turned out okay. It's like, how many times in the middle of the night do I have the parade of the terribles where there's 4 or 5 bad things that I'm so worried about, and inevitably the next day or within the next couple of days, every one of them lines up and everything's fine. And he's like, how did that work for you? Why'd you stay up all night? You know, but he's giving us training. That's like our boot camp, you know, training to get through that, so that maybe the next time I won't stay up all night, or maybe I'll stay up half the night instead of the whole night, or, you know.
Yes.
It's going to sound really weak and probably negative, but it's a question, because that's what I did all my life. I do a lot of different kinds of training, a lot of physical, a lot of painful, and I finally broke. For 20 years I've been at peak every single day, all day long. And sometimes it's, you can't function. I told my sister hurt her neck, and I said, you gotta own it, you know, in your body, you know, you'll learn how to kind of, you know, overcome it, and but then it'll ramp up and it'll ramp up. What happens when you just don't know if you want to do it?
Yeah.
It's a very good question. And it's easy to talk about this in terms of what we've done this evening, but sometimes the suffering seems interminable. Sometimes it goes on for years and years and years. And all I can say to you is that I think the formula is the same. I think draw closer to God, put your head down, embrace the pain, and He'll carry you through it. He'll carry you through it.
Really, it does. You just wonder if you want to go the next step or not.
I appreciate that. We've all felt that way. Sadiq?
There's two things. One thing in Islam, it says, God will never place any burden upon you that you cannot bear. One thing in Islam is God says He'll never place a burden upon you that you cannot bear. So anything that comes to you, He knows your capacity already and knows that you can handle it. The second thing is, how do we handle disease? Most of the cures that you get when you get a flu shot, they give you a little bit of the flu.
Of course.
And so that your body will build up an immunity to it. The reason there was no Native Americans or a few Spaniards came over and conquered the whole Inca Empire is because they didn't have an immunity to diseases that they had. But once your body gets that immunity to it, once you get that disease in you, now your body's capable of fighting it back. So in a sense, when God is testing you, He's giving you that immunity. He's getting that little shot so that your body will build up the strength. The next time, your spirit will build up the strength to say, hey, you know what? We can fight my antibodies, my anti-negative bodies, my anti-Satan bodies will cancel this out in us.
Well, yeah, I understand. I stopped doing all my medications for pain, and about 8 days later, I walked 7.5 miles through the desert.
Oh.
And for about 2.5 weeks, I thought I was going to die.
Oh.
I'm still kind of coming off that, but so I did find out one thing, that I could do it no matter what. You know what I mean? I'm wondering what use that has, but I mean, it was kind of like cool. You know, I can do it. You can do it if you have to. I'm just not sometimes you just don't.
You don't want to.
You know, I heard a message once, and I thought it really rung a bell with me. The whole point of the message, this pastor's giving his message, and the whole point was, if he had a difficult task to accomplish, who would he select to stand shoulder to shoulder with him to accomplish it? And his point was, I would select the people who have had the hardest lives, the people that have known the most trouble, because those people are refined. They've been trained, and they're now equipped to go out and do this difficult thing that we're going to accomplish together. So all I can say, easy for me to say, don't give up. Don't give up.
I was trying so deeply to find what is role in my life, and then it just hit me. My purpose is to help other people. So somehow the God sending me the people who are in pain and suffering, who need help, and somehow I am able to heal them motivationally, emotionally, compassionately, educationally. And I was very, very sick. I was diagnosed with diabetes, I was having seizure, I didn't want to live, I had so many thoughts, and I didn't know where I was going. And I was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I decided to leave this where I was where I had everything, food and everything, and to go to New York, to go among the people, in a jungle of people where I don't have anything, nothing, where I have to fight for everything, and somehow I was able to overcome my disease. I was almost on my deathbed. I had seizures, I was shaking all the time. I had high blood pressure, 110, the lower pressure systolic. And then I realized the more I'm helping people, the more I'm trying to understand them and give them their advice and try to understand them, the more I felt better about myself. And I overcome the disease somehow, I don't know. It's a miracle, God.
And you told me last week that growing up, you endured a lot of abuse, and I think that's equipped you to do what you're doing today.
I could
and to help
relate
other
to
people.
anybody,
Yeah.
any suffering. I've been there.
So God had a purpose in that suffering that you endured, and that purpose was to refine you into a person that can go out and help others that are suffering.
Yeah, I got broken by my father, every single bone. I was bleeding. I could not put short sleeves. I had to put long sleeves so will not see over there that is whole wounds, open wounds. And even I got to experience my mother lying that I fall down instead of telling that he broke my head. And I said, I don't know why I had to go through this. But now I realize this is why I had to go through so I can help others.
That's exactly why.
Once you guys find your purpose, then it's swimming downstream. And my purpose is to help achieve dreams of other people. I'm living my dream already.
Yeah, I pray for the rear view mirror where I can finally see the purpose in what some of the things I've gone through. And I think we should all be looking for the rear view mirror.
You know, one of the things back to military training is when they're preparing you to be able to handle torture, you're taught to love the pain, which is the same thing we're talking about here.
Right.
If once you start to love the pain has no effect on you. It has no control. It's not your master anymore. So now when you run into those challenges in life, when you say, thank you, Lord, for this, it's like Satan says, what am I going to do with this guy now?
Yeah.
We tried everything. He's still going.
Or like the when Paul and Peter were in prison, and they learned to love the tormentor too.
Right.
You know.
Get addicted to pain.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's never ceases to amaze me. God's economy is so different than what we learn in our culture. I mean, his view of pain is quite different than the way we are raised to look at pain. Mark.
What a wonderful topic and discussion about it. What a wonderful topic and discussion, really. It fits us in our human reality. I think we have a choice when we're faced with conflict, when we're faced with suffering, when we're faced with the big bad monster, whatever that is. And one choice is that we can either get mad at God. You know, why did you do this to me? Why haven't you healed my father? Why? Or we can even passively go into addiction or go into some kind of pain-numbing life experience or something, you know, as kind of a subconscious way of just kind of disconnecting with it. Or we can choose to seek God, choose to draw near to God, you know, choose to spend time in prayer and choose to spend time with God. And I just think that in God's economy, I think that He values intimacy with Him over personal comfort, and that even in suffering, that if we are able to experience intimacy with God on a deeper level through our suffering, I think that there's something accomplished there.
Good comes out of it. Sometimes it doesn't come for a while, and sometimes it's difficult to recognize immediately. But
Let me add one
Good
more
comes out of it.
option to that.
Yeah.
So, one is to go into addiction, one is to do all the different things you just mentioned. The other is what Mark and I have a tendency to do, and that
Speak
is
for yourself.
to become self-sufficient. The sin of self-sufficiency, to say to become self-sufficient, and have that sin of self-sufficiency where we're like, the more freaked out and afraid and hard things get, the harder I'm going to work, and the more I'm going to do, and the less I'm going to sleep, and the more I'm going to rely on my own abilities, because this is going to go poorly if it's not for me, because I'm the only one that can fix this. Nobody else can handle it, So that's another, very
There's
sinful.
a book-
Very sinful. Yeah.
there's a great book written about guys called Wild at Heart. And that's the theory of the author, is that when you're wounded as a child, you develop the false self. And I really identify with that because I developed the false self. When I was a little kid, my brother, there were just two of us, my brother and I. He was older, bigger, stronger, better looking, faster, smarter. All the girls liked him, and I was a wimp. I wasn't a good athlete. I wasn't strong. I was kind of recessive. And so I tried when I was in elementary school to play basketball and try to be like him, and it wasn't happening. And so when I was about 10 years old, I can remember the very day it happened, I said, no one is ever going to laugh at me again. So I took on the false self, and I became a monomaniac, an athletic maniac.
Wow.
And I, through just sheer determination, made it through high school athletics, college athletics, NC2A championship.
Wow.
And it was all based on the false self. And when I look in the rearview mirror at that, I realized that occupied probably 20 years of my life and led to some horrible consequences for me, the false self. So what I should have been doing was not what I did. What I did is I became self-sufficient and let the false self take over my life. And it's as bad as any addiction. I was for 20 years addicted with success.
What would you have done differently?
What would I have done differently? Well, at that age, I probably could have had some guidance because I was really too young to understand it. I didn't really understand it until many years later.
Wow.
But I think we have that experience. What Liz said is true. I mean, I think our personalities, because we both came from backgrounds where we were wounded as kids, and our personalities are, when things aren't going good, man, you bear down, you get on it, and we're very kind of manic that way, and that's a dangerous thing, because that's what I was
doing that instead of leaning on God.
Instead of leaning on God. I mean, it's what I was saying when we did the Bible study. I was saying, so long as we rely on our own cleverness, our own strength, our own ability to extract ourselves from difficult circumstances, we're never going to get there. We're never going to be powerful. So,
Or if you're praying to God to help you be more self-confident, to be able to be more, it's like everything we said is like backwards. It goes against humility. It's like when you obtain what you think is your own success story, you're proving to yourself that your self-worth or your self-confidence in doing, whether it's a job or helping friends, or it's starting to build in your brain what you're capable of doing on your own self, and then you start taking pride in that. And you're even taught, and I was, you take pride in your work. Not pride as a sin, pride is doing a good job, and being prideful and accomplishing something, a goal. But it seems like it works against leaning on the help of and the need of.
I think when we say I take pride in my work, I take pride in my accomplishments, I think we have to really look at our motive, what's driving it. With me, the false self drove it. All the success I had as an athlete, all driven by the false self. And I took on all the glory, and I was the one that enjoyed that life of bragging and pride. I think, though, when it's better to say, instead of saying I have pride in my work, it's better to say that I have pride in God who's given me the ability to do my work heartily.
Well,
I think it's the mindset, the whole motive behind what we're doing.
Let's the do your work heartily as to the Lord and not as to man, because it's the Lord Christ whom you serve. And I feel like it's that also, that kind of combines for me with perfect love casts out fear. And so like if you are doing everything because you love God, you're going to do it in the darkest times, you're going to do it in the lonely times, you're going to do it when nobody's looking. You're going to do it for all the right reasons. And it's going to cast out all the fear you feel of failure or of inadequacy or any of those things, because you're doing it for the love of God.
I would have been better to just stay a wimp and grow up and hopefully go down the right road than to accomplish what I did, because it really, the price was too high. It took 20 years of my life and cast it aside. Now, I was being prepared for something, but during that 20 years, I was really not much good to anyone, so.
Mark, you go too. One over here.
Yes.
Weren't you going to say something?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
I wanted to say that me and Alec and Jeremy were sitting there and we were talking exactly about the same thing you're talking tonight, which is phenomenal, amazing. And even to the point where it said, you have grace, you have powerful, like, and they said no, and I said, well, at least a glimpse accepted, you know? So I wanted to share, when you said 155,000 or something?
155 times.
Times, yeah. That number ran to me in at 3 a.m. 2 days ago. My father he passed away on 3/31/1993, and he was very abusive. I mean, he almost, to the point where he almost killed me, and I almost actually took my own life to stop the pain and suffering that was unbearable for, you know, a child girl like me. So I dreamed him, and in that dream I had won the lottery, and I was crying because I was like, wow, 3 in the morning I'm waking up and I'm having the numbers. It happened to me before, and yes, the numbers came out. But when I was looking at the numbers, my dad was looking at me and he's like, why are you crying? You just won the lottery. You can pay everything you want. And I just looking at 155 times, like times what? Thousands or millions? And I was just looking at the number at 3 a.m. I mean, in my dream, and I woke up from my dream. And the number to me meant, that's not going to change who I am, because I overcome the worst of the worst, and it was like amazing grace appeared in the 155. It was of abundance. So whatever I go through life, and I've been very patient, because it's been like everything that anybody could experience in their lives. If it didn't happen to me, it happened to my children, and that hurts more as being a mother. But I got to this point, I mean, that I can remember, I became very humble and understanding and wisdom, and I pray for those things daily. So I face life with joy. Nothing that I have not overcome, it's not new to me, meaning I can overcome anything because I've been through the worst. How worse can this get? I already been through the worst and overcome it.
You made it.
I made it. So now it's just the joy that I share. And like, I like when people go humbly say, pray for my family, they're sick, and you know, and then thank you for your prayers because they're doing better. I love to hear the people that are humble more than the complainers, because the complainers, they're gonna go through it until they're humble. It's gonna happen.
Right.
And so I already see the promise. In other words, I see the light and everything. So
Well, see, you're living-
I'm very joyful.
you're living
no
proof.
matter what.
In what Paul's teaching us tonight.
Yes.
That's awesome. Okay, thanks everyone. Everyone else? Jeff?
Oh, I was just going to tell you, I live